Hi, I'm Papia. In this problem, we have to sketch a graph of 4 different functions and we have to compare their graphs with the graph of y equals x squared. So the first function is 1/2 x squared and we have the graph of x squared right here. So how can we compare the graph of x squared with 1/2 x squared? Well, since there is a coefficient 1/2 in front of the x squared expression, and because 1/2 is less than 1, what will happen is the graph of f will shrink by a factor of 1/2 vertically. So when you graph it, it will look like, roughly, it'll look like this. So it shrinks. Well, just to make sure that you understand, what happens is if you pick an x value, say x equals 1, and if you compare the y values for these two graphs, so the top one is x squared and the bottom one is our function 1/2 x squared. And if you compare the y values, see at x equals 1, the y value for x squared was 1, but the y value for 1/2 x squared is 1/2. So that's what it means by this new graph is getting shrinked. Okay, let's move on to the next function. Next function is g, and the expression is -1/8 x squared. All right, so note there is a constant 1/8 and it is less than 1, which means that the graph of g will shrink by a factor of 1/8. But also there is a negative sign, okay, which means that this parabola will open downward. All right, so let's see. If we graph it, remember, it will shrink by a factor of 1/8 and then it will be reflected about x-axis. So it will look something like this. Again, if you compare with some x values, x equals 1, you know that for x squared, the y value is 1. But for this new function g, the y value will be -1/8. Okay. Moving on, third function. This one is 3/2 x squared. So look at this constant again. Now 3/2 is greater than 1. Therefore, the graph of h will stretch by a factor of 3/2. Which means, so this is the graph of x squared, h of x is getting stretched vertically, which means it will look like something like this, roughly. Well, if you compare at an x value, say x equals 1, for x squared you know the y is 1, but for the new function you get the y value to be 3/2. Last function is k of x and is equal to -3 x squared. First, note that the constant is 3, which is greater than 1, which means that the graph of k will stretch by a factor of 3. But also there is the negative sign. So the negative sign means the parabola will open downward. So first stretch it, then reflect it about x-axis. So this is x squared, and kx will look something like this. So at 1, the value will be about -3. Okay, so we compared all 4 functions and their graphs with the graph of x squared. Thank you.